Some games don't just entertain you. They quietly shape how you think about stories, music, characters, and even time itself. The PS2 era was full of RPGs like that. Games you didn't just play, but lived with. You remember where you were when you beat certain bosses. You remember the menus, the save sounds, the loading screens. And years later, parts of those worlds still stick with you. This list isn't about which PS2 RPGs were technically the best on paper. It's about the ones that defined childhoods. The ones that felt huge, emotional, and unforgettable when you first touched a controller, and somehow still hold up today. If you end up liking the content, please subscribe for more, and I'd appreciate it if you give it a thumbs up and tell me what you think down below. Love to hear it. Final Fantasy X wasn't just another entry in a long-running series. It was a moment. For many players, it was their first fully voiced RPG, and that alone made it feel revolutionary. Hearing characters speak instead of reading text boxes created an emotional connection that felt new at the time, even awkward in places, but undeniably powerful. The world of Spira felt alive in a way few RPG worlds had before. From tropical beaches to ruined temples, everything carried a sense of history and quiet sadness. The story slowly revealed itself as something much darker than it first appeared, dealing with themes of faith, sacrifice, and inevitability. What made it hit so hard was how personal it felt. Titus wasn't a legendary hero. He was confused, displaced, and slowly realizing that growing up sometimes means accepting painful truths. Combat was turn-based, but incredibly readable and strategic. The conditional turn-based system let you see exactly who would act next, making battles feel more like puzzles than reflex tests. The sphere grid became a defining feature, letting players customize characters in ways that felt empowering without being overwhelming. You could follow the intended paths or break the system open entirely if you wanted. The soundtrack elevated everything. Tracks like the Xanarcan didn't just play in the background. They became emotional anchors. Even now, hearing that opening melody instantly pulls players back into the game. Final Fantasy X wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was earnest, ambitious, and unforgettable. And for many, it was the RPG that taught them games could make you feel something real.
Stay away from the summoner!
You're a bad... My school's...
Persona 4 didn't just define childhoods. It quietly defined routines. For many players, it became part of daily life. You didn't just play in long sessions. You lived alongside it day by day, month by month, following a calendar that felt strangely real. Set in the quiet rural town of Inaba, the game contrasted everyday normalcy with supernatural horror in a way that felt unsettling and intimate. Murders were happening, but school still went on. Friends still argued. Exams still mattered. That blend made the story hit harder because the danger felt uncomfortably close to home. The core of the game wasn't dungeon crawling. It was relationships. Social links weren't side content. They were the heart of the experience. Getting to know classmates, shop owners, and oddball townsfolk wasn't just flavor. It made you stronger in battle and more invested emotionally. The game rewarded empathy, patience, and paying attention to people. Combat built on the Shin Megami Tensei foundation, but made it more approachable without sacrificing depth. Exploiting weaknesses, chaining all-out attacks, and fusing personas created a satisfying rhythm that stayed engaging even deep into the game's long runtime. What truly cemented Persona 4 as a defining PS2 experience was its tone. Despite dealing with identity, fear, and hidden truths, it never lost its warmth. There was laughter, awkward moments, and genuine friendship. The soundtrack, especially its upbeat vocal tracks, gave the game an energy that stuck with players long after they turned the console off. Kingdom Hearts 2 was pure imagination given form. On paper, the idea sounded ridiculous. Anime characters fighting alongside Disney icons with oversized keys, but somehow it worked. And not just worked, it became deeply personal for an entire generation. The sequel refined everything from the original. Combat was faster, flashier, and far more expressive, allowing players to chain together attacks, magic, summons, and movement into fluid action that felt incredible once mastered. The drive forms added a risk-reward system that encouraged aggressive play while constantly changing how Sora controlled. It wasn't just button mashing, it rewarded timing, positioning, and experimentation. Narratively, this leaned hard into emotional stakes. Loss, memory, identity, and connection became central themes, especially through characters like Roxas, whose story still stands as one of the most impactful openings in JRPG history. Even if the plot became confusing at times, the emotions landed. You didn't need to understand every detail to feel the weight of what was happening. What really defined the game for many players was how it blended childhood nostalgia with surprisingly heavy ideas. One moment you're exploring a familiar Disney world. The next you're questioning the nature of existence and friendship. That contrast made the experience feel magical and unsettling at the same time. Years later, its combat depth is still praised, its soundtrack still iconic, and its emotional beats still remembered. Kingdom Hearts 2 wasn't just a crossover. It was a coming-of-age RPG disguised as a fantasy adventure, and for a lot of players, it arrived at exactly the right time in their lives.
When Fonist invaded the manor?
Tales of the Abyss is one of those RPGs that grows with you. At first, it feels familiar. Colorful visuals, real-time combat, anime-style characters. But the longer you play, the more it reveals a surprisingly heavy emotional core. For many PS2 players, this was their introduction to a story that wasn't afraid to let its protagonist be deeply flawed. Luke starts out spoiled, arrogant, and frustrating. And that's intentional. Watching him slowly confront the consequences of his ignorance is what gives the story its power. The game isn't about instant redemption. It's about accountability and change. Few RPGs of that era dared to make their lead so unlikable at first, and fewer still committed fully to his transformation. Combat used the linear motion battle system, but Abyss refined it with free-run movement and field of effect abilities that made positioning matter more than ever. Battles felt fast and expressive, rewarding aggressive play while still requiring coordination between party members. The system struck a balance between accessibility and depth that made it easy to enjoy while still offering room to master. The world building was dense, touching on themes of fate, identity, and free will. Concepts like replication and prophecy weren't just lore, they directly influenced character arcs and moral choices. Combined with a strong cast and an excellent soundtrack, the game delivered emotional beats that stuck with players long after the credits rolled. Tales of the Abyss didn't just entertain. It challenged players to think about responsibility, growth, and what it really means to change.
Master Van said he was returning home to look for it.
That's why I wanted to ask you this favor.
Dragon Quest VIII felt like stepping into a living storybook. At a time when many RPGs were chasing realism or darker tones, this game embraced color, charm, and warmth. And that decision made it timeless. The cel-shaded art style wasn't just a visual choice, it was a statement. Years later, it still looks incredible because it never tried to look real in the first place. The world was massive by PS2 standards, filled with wide-open fields, winding roads, and towns that felt genuinely distinct from one another. Exploration mattered. You weren't just moving from story beat to story beat. You were wandering, discovering secrets, and slowly piecing together the history of a kingdom broken by a curse. The central story was simple on the surface, but its emotional weight came from how personal it felt. It gave the journey a quiet sense of melancholy beneath all that charm. Combat stayed true to classic turn-based roots, but it was polished to near perfection. Every character had a clear role, and the tension system added excitement without overcomplicating things. The skill point system allowed real customization, letting players shape their party based on how they prefer to play rather than forcing rigid classes. What made Dragon Quest VIII unforgettable for so many players was how comfortable it felt. The humor, the pacing, the music, it all created a sense of adventure that was welcoming rather than overwhelming. It wasn't trying to shock you. It wanted you to relax, explore, and fall in love with its world. For a lot of kids growing up with the PS2, this was the RPG that taught them the joy of getting lost in a game. Shin Megami Tensei 3. Nocturne didn't try to welcome players, it challenged them. For a lot of kids growing up with the PS2, this was the first RPG that made them realize games weren't always meant to be comforting or fair. From the opening hours, Nocturne establishes a cold, oppressive atmosphere that feels completely different from the bright fantasy worlds most RPGs were offering at the time. The setting alone was unforgettable. A ruined Tokyo locked in a perpetual apocalypse, populated by demons, cults, and gods all fighting over what the world should become next. There are no clear heroes or villains here, just ideologies. The game forces you to choose what kind of future you believe in, and every option feels morally uncomfortable in its own way. Combat was brutally strategic. Exploiting weaknesses wasn't optional, it was survival. The press-turn system punished sloppy play and rewarded preparation, making every encounter feel dangerous, even against regular enemies. Negotiating with demons added another layer of tension. One wrong dialogue choice could cost you resources, your life, or an opportunity to recruit a powerful ally. Customization ran deep, fusing demons, inheriting skills, and shaping the demi-fiend's abilities gave players an incredible amount of control, but also demanded commitment. There was no easy reset. Mistakes stuck with you, and learning the systems often meant failing first. What made Nocturne defining wasn't just its difficulty, it was its confidence. It trusted players to adapt, to think, and to endure. For many, it was the PS2 RPG that proved games didn't need hand-holding to be unforgettable. Star Ocean, Till the End of Time, was ambitious to a fault, and that's exactly why it left such a lasting impression. It tried to blend fast-paced action combat with massive sci-fi and fantasy world building, and for many PS2 players, it was unlike anything they had experienced before. Combat happened in real time, with characters freely moving across small battle arenas, chaining attacks, and managing skills on the fly. It felt kinetic and exciting, especially compared to more traditional turn-based systems. Mastering battle skills, managing MP consumption, and positioning correctly separated casual play from high-level mastery. The game scale was enormous. Multiple planets, long dungeons, sprawling towns, and a seemingly endless amount of side content gave the impression that the game might never end. Crafting systems, optional bosses, post-game challenges, and hidden characters rewarded players willing to dive deep. Narratively, this is infamous for its mid-game twist, one that split fans and sparked debates that still haven't fully settled. Some players felt it recontextualized the entire series in a way that undermined its themes. Others appreciated the boldness and philosophical ambition. Either way, it's impossible to deny that the game took risks few RPGs dare to take. Despite its flaws, pacing issues, occasional difficulty spikes, and a story that doesn't always land cleanly, Star Ocean, Till the End of Time defined a certain kind of PS2 RPG experience. Big, messy, ambitious, and unforgettable.
Just relax.
Dark Cloud 2 felt like it contained multiple full games inside one cartridge. At a glance, it looked like a colorful action RPG, but the deeper you went, the more systems revealed themselves. Dungeon crawling, town building, photography, invention, fishing, golf, somehow it all worked together into something incredibly cohesive. The core gameplay loop mixed real-time combat with randomized dungeons, forcing players to manage weapons carefully since they could permanently break if overused. That alone taught a lot of players patience and planning early on. Instead of simply grinding levels, success depended on upgrading gear, choosing when to repair, and understanding enemy patterns. It made progression feel deliberate rather than automatic. What truly made this unforgettable was the diorama system. Rebuilding towns wasn't a side activity. It was central to the story. You weren't just saving the world abstractly. You were restoring it piece by piece, placing houses, arranging residents, and meeting specific requirements to unlock better futures made the player feel directly responsible for the world's recovery. The invention system added another layer of creativity. By taking photos of objects in the environment, players could combine ideas to invent new weapons, tools, and machines. It rewarded curiosity and experimentation in a way few RPGs even attempt today. Visually, the game leaned into a soft, anime-inspired art style that aged gracefully. Combined with a warm soundtrack and an adventurous tone, Dark Cloud 2 became a comfort game for many players. Deep enough to obsess over, but inviting enough to relax with for hours at a time. Suikoden 3 took a bold step forward by reimagining how stories could be told in RPGs. Instead of following a single protagonist, the game unfolds through multiple perspectives, each with its own motivations, alliances, and interpretations of the same events. This structure made the world feel larger and more complex than anything the series had attempted before. Set against the backdrop of political conflict and war, the story explores how misunderstandings and ideology can turn neighbors into enemies. Playing as different characters forces you to confront how truth shifts depending on who's telling the story. It's a mature narrative approach that rewards patience and empathy. Combat blended traditional turn-based battles with large-scale war encounters and one-on-one duels, maintaining the series' trademark variety. Recruiting allies still mattered, and building your army felt meaningful rather than cosmetic. Every character added personality to the world, whether they were fighters, strategists, or support figures. While the transition to 3D visuals was divisive at the time, Suikoden 3's ambition is undeniable. Its willingness to experiment with narrative structure and perspective made it a defining PS2 RPG for players ready to engage with something deeper than a straightforward hero's journey. For many, it was the moment they realized RPGs could tell stories that felt genuinely human, messy, conflicting, and unforgettable. Shadow Hearts. Covenant took everything the first game built and refined it into one of the most emotionally resonant RPGs on the PS2. Where many JRPGs leaned into idealism, Covenant wasn't afraid to explore grief, regret, and the scars left behind by war. Set in an alternate version of early 20th century Europe, the game blends historical settings with gothic horror and dark fantasy. This grounding made the story hit harder. You weren't saving a vague fantasy kingdom. You were navigating a world shaped by real-world conflict and loss. The tone was mature without being self-indulgent, balancing humor and darkness in a way that felt human. The Judgment Ring system returned and evolved, turning every attack, spell, and item use into a timing-based challenge. It kept combat engaging throughout the entire game, forcing players to stay focused rather than mindlessly selecting commands. Optional risk zones rewarded skilled play, adding tension even during routine battles. Character writing was where Covenant truly shined. Yuri's arc in particular stands out as one of the strongest protagonist journeys of the era, a story about guilt, responsibility, and learning to live with past mistakes. Supporting characters weren't just party members. They felt like people shaped by trauma, belief, and love. While Shadow Hearts never reached mainstream popularity, this became a defining RPG for those who found it. It proved that PS2 RPGs could be dark, experimental, and emotionally complex without losing their soul.